Good evening and welcome. I explained to Ulrike that in Cambridge we're not as Pope-like as in Germany. So I hope that the distractors will arrive whilst I am doing my introduction. But welcome to the third James Meade Lecture. I'm Simon MacDonald, Master of Christ. And James Meade was one of our most distinguished fellows, one of our Nobel laureates. I learned in my research that Oriel College, Oxford and Christ Cambridge share a couple of Nobel laureates. So he is one of them. And we're very proud to remember him and honour him, and especially glad this evening that there is a personal link to James Meade, because his daughter, Carol, is with us, with her husband, Praful Dasgupta, so we welcome both of you. This evening's lecturer is Professor Ulrike Malmendier. I am not an academic, and I'm not as used to all of you as reading academic CVs, but I have to say that Ulrike's looks impossibly distinguished. That she has 6 degrees, including two PhDs from the University of Bonn and from Harvard. She's worked at the University of Chicago, she's worked at Stanford, and since 2006 has been at the University of California at Berkeley, where she has been a full professor since 2012. She is part of the top 5% most cited economists in the world. She is prize-winning, and since August 2022, she has been the first overseas-based member of the economic advisors to the government of Germany. This group used to be called the Wise Men, but now Ulrike is there. They're called the 5 Sages. And Ulrike joins us from a meeting yesterday in Berlin. She's going back to Bonn tomorrow, so we're very lucky to have her. The title is Arrested: The Long-Term Effects of Crisis Experiences, Evidence on CEO Stress, Aging and Death. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Ulrike Malmendier.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and sorry about the title. I hope it's not too much of a downer. I'm very, very pleased to have received this introduction, to be invited to speak to you all tonight in honor of James Meade, who I think a lot of us economists remember for his contributions in international trade. May I say that for me, as a person who straddles finance and economics, in particular the work on international capital markets and capital flows has been quite interesting. The topic I'm going to talk about today, how past experiences and crises a country lives through can have really long-lasting effects on behavior and market structure and market outcomes, is also applicable to international finance. And in fact, without knowing much about international at all, have dared to write a paper about it. So I'll briefly touch on it later in the slides. But for now, I just kind of wanted to start from giving maybe a little bit of an overview of what this agenda about experience effects, about how our past can have long-term scarring effects on us, even if everything is good again and the crisis is over. I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview, and then I will zoom in particular that paper, this more recent paper on CEO stress and aging. With that, let me use an example that should be all familiar to us to kind of introduce the concept I want to talk about, which is the recent experience of all of us living through the COVID-19 crisis. Now, when economists, when we all encountered this, economists immediately go out and ask, okay, what's going to be the effect on human decision-making behavior, belief formation, etc.? And a lot of the work initially focused on the immediate impact. So, we had to stay at home. How does it affect our consumption behavior? We have less interaction at work, in stores, with physicians. So telemedicine takes off. We start to use yoga and HIIT apps instead of going into the studio. Robinhood, this online trading outlet, is trending on Twitter. I mean, and now X, everyone is a day trader now. And so that was, of course, what we immediately witnessed. Going beyond that, economists have wondered, what could be the longer-term impact of living through that crisis. So medium-term effects of the pandemic on earnings and wealth. Maybe we lost our job, we didn't finish our education, maybe different career paths and educational paths change. In the US, in the wake of all of these changes, a lot of universities dropped their admission tests. And so admissions started to look very differently, health outcomes in terms of vaccination requirements, etc. Now, what I'm, however, interested in is whether these experiences, whether what in our professional or personal life we live through as we are walking, our path, can have an impact on us beyond changes that happen around us, beyond changes in our job situation, in our health, etc. Could it be the case that the experience of having personally gone through, for example, the COVID-19 crisis, as opposed to literally knowing everything about it, right? That's what we professors think. If we only teach stuff well enough, then people fully incorporated it. Could there still be a difference between having full, perfect information and rationally processing it versus having personally experienced it? So for that, a little thought experiment. So assume that still talking about the COVID-19 crisis. So suppose, that given that you're here, you survived it, health-wise, hopefully relatively well. I hope no long COVID. So, but suppose not only in terms of your personal health outcome, but all measures we economists like to look at. Income situation, wealth accumulation, career progression, etc. All these measures say we are back to the world pre-COVID-19. If I look at you today, and then I look at you pre-COVID, I mean, you look the same, just a couple of years older, and hopefully your salary has risen and your wealth has accumulated. But, nothing in the usual data I can detect that would say there is a kind of long-term effect. So under these assumptions, the standard models we economists have, and actually even the behavioral models, the non-standard models, right, would say, yes, we are back to people behaving just like they would have behaved without the COVID-19 crisis. In terms of economic and financial decision-making, that's what the prediction of economics would be. Now, of course, that's not what all economists say, but if they say there are changes, then it's typically because the circumstances have changed. We're not really back to pre-COVID-19. We have all learned how to do virtual meetings via Zoom, and that's maybe why we conduct ourselves a little bit differently. But to the extent that everything is the same, we should behave the same. Well, it turns out that's not what I see in the behavior of my students, in the behavior of staff, in the behavior of colleagues. There are changes I notice in terms of their preferences of working from home versus working in school. There are preferences in consumption. There are preferences in terms of, or behavior in terms of how much interaction you want that seem to have changed. So where I'm going with all of that is I'm really trying to ask you the question, what about we have changed and we behave differently, even if the world around us has returned back to the pre-COVID-19 situation? That's kind of the claim I want to put out here. And to kind of make it clearer how that's in contrast to traditional model in economics, traditional models of economics don't really have room to accommodate this notion, right? In traditional models of economics, the effect of a personally experienced pandemic or financial crisis or other macroeconomic shock cannot be any different from you being personally, ideally, perfectly informed about the information and processing it all. Of course, ceteris paribus, meaning we're holding constant all the usual variables, your income, health, wealth, educational attainment. So the effect of living through the Great Depression or another economic depression on financial investment, should be no different from just learning from the textbook or finance professors like me, okay, stock market slumps and economic crisis and worldwide economic crisis can happen occasionally, it's a very low probability, you learn everything about it, should have exact same impact as having personally lived through, say, the Great Depression. Having a personally experienced unemployment, right? Either growing up in your family and you see like what that means for your family life or for yourself, if you might not have enough money to cover your month's needs, should be no different in terms of your future consumption and investment behavior, savings behavior, than knowing, okay, from today's perspective, I have a job, I know my risk of unemployment, I take that into account, I rationally update, I have this behavior. Whether or not you personally experience shouldn't make a difference. If you have two people today, exact same situation, exact same job situation, it's same risk of losing their job going forward. Whether or not in the past you experience unemployment should not make a difference. And finally, living through a pandemic should be no different from knowing about the likelihood and implications. And what models and the empirical evidence, which we have coined experience effects, tries to say is that's not right. We get huge predictive power from collecting data on what has happened to you in the past. It seems to have a lasting impact on your beliefs, on your updating, and on your actual choices, your behaviors. In the negative case, it's scarring effects. I will talk about negative cases a lot today, I'm sorry. But it does actually also work for the positive cases. And that is actually, as I will try to argue, consistent with what we know from the natural sciences, for what we know about neuroplasticity, about synaptic tagging. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, before I do that, let me mention just two examples from the early research that started this agenda. The first one is a paper with Stefan Nagel on depression babies. So people who in the US lived through the Great Depression and have this reputation of remaining super risk averse for, well, if not their whole life, for a very long time. People who experience what you see in the headlines here, billions lost as stocks crash, Wall Street in panic as stocks crash. Those are the people where their children might say, oh, my parents were depression babies and as a result avoided stock market and all things risky like the plague. And in this paper, we basically show in a regression framework that that's indeed the case. And in fact, not only for the Great Depression, if you give me your birth year and the data of the country you grew up in, and I can calculate the average stock market returns in that country where you were exposed to this news and personally experienced it, I get pretty high predictive power on your willingness to be a stock market participant today. So to just show this in the raw data, this is US data showing stock market participation rates between mid-30s and mid-40s for different cohorts. If you look at the left bar, the cohort born up to 1920, that generation experienced the Great Depression as teenagers, adult, and they have a significantly lower stock market participation rate than all other cohorts, with 13%. Everybody else later, 26 to 32. Now, of course, there's an increasing trend over time, but you do see some fluctuation. So go to the third bar, the highest one here. Can one see that? I cannot see that very well here. That cohort experienced the post-World War II boom years in the US in their young adult life and has a participation rate in their mid-30s to 40s, holding age constant, that's more than twice as high than that of the depression babies. But if you go to the next bar, it dips down again. That's the 41 to 50 cohort. And the dipping is consistent with the fact that this cohort reached that age, mid-30s to mid-40s, just after the stagflation oil price crisis years of the 1970s. So this, of course, just raw data. In what we show in the paper in a controlled individual level regression framework is that indeed, if I compare two people, person one has had a pretty miserable stock market experience in her life so far, so she's at the 10th percentile of the whole distribution of possible stock market experiences. And I compare that person to somebody who was lucky and was born at a time and now has an age so that their lifetime average stock market experience is at the 90th percentile. So I look at the so-called interdecile range. The comparing person bad experience to really good experience means that's a shift. I will observe a shift in risk tolerance. The 90th percentile person has more than 10 percentage point lower likelihood of being super risk averse. But more concretely, if I look at do they actually participate in the stock market, yes, that good experienced person is 14 percentage points more likely compared to average rate around 37%. And actually you can do similar things in the bond market. You can look at bond market experiences and bond market investment, and same thing. So there on average we have a rate for, this is data of almost the last 100 years of from the SCF out of Michigan. We have an increase of 15 percentage points compared to an average of kind of 38%. So really, what has happened in your life, in this case to these big markets, where of course individually you have very little influence, leaves a lasting impact on your attitude towards that asset, that market, where you had these good or bad experiences. Another example is actually the example where Stefan Nagel and I, who are both German, where we started from, is inflation, fear of inflation, may I say obsession about inflation, which is something we Germans are sometimes known for. And often people say, well, maybe that has to do with you guys having this Weimar hyperinflation early in the last century. And in fact, even later generations like me and like Stefan grow up seeing in their textbooks these pictures of kids playing with bundles of Reichsmark, which are completely worthless. So that was our German motivation. There's also US motivation to look at how personal experiences of inflation may affect you. And that's, of course, from the 70s, again, this oil price crisis years, from the 70s peaking in 1980, where inflation reached this double-digit level, and like the Fed chair per person was like unclear on how to ever get it back to normal again. And Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed at the time, was indeed saying, you know, like my problem is that a generation of young adults has grown up knowing only inflation, nothing but inflation that seems to keep accelerating. And as he said, in these circumstances, it's hardly surprising that many citizens have begun to wonder whether it's realistic to anticipate a return to general price stability. It's a nice summary of the research hypothesis in experience effect agenda. This notion that if you've grown up seeing nothing but inflation, whatever theory, totally credible theory and explanations I give you with what measures I get inflation back to kind of normal, to the 2% we are targeting, I might understand the theory, but I don't really believe it, because I haven't personally experienced it. I almost thought last year, in addition to a German motivation and a US motivation, we might have a UK motivation because, inflation didn't look so good, but I guess we're coming down again. So hopefully that was short enough so that you don't have long-term scarring effects from that experience. So now what we show in the paper is, that when you ask people about, their beliefs about how inflation will develop over the next years, of course, lots of factors play a role, how informed they are, what their education is, what their gender is. Actually, women tend to be more pessimistic. But very importantly, you can also ask them, when are you born again? What was the country? Calculate quickly lifetime average inflation experiences, and same thing. You get really high predictive power. So when forming inflation expectations, we show that individuals put a higher weight on realizations that happen during their lifetime than any other historical data that's also available to them. And that's not just then something that predicts what the answer to a survey I give them when I ask them about what you think inflation will be. That actually affects behavior. That affects, for example, so-called tenure choices. So do you want to buy a home in which you live, or are you okay with renting also for longer periods? Conditional on buying, what type of mortgage do you want to use? So many countries have both fixed rate and variable rate mortgages, and people who have lived through high inflation, they absolutely hate variable rate mortgages because they always fear inflation is around the corner, nominal rates will go up, this will be a terrible deal, let me stick to fixed rate. Vice versa, they don't like investing in fixed income bonds. They would love variable rates because they think, well, you don't know, but I know, interest rate and inflation will go up next time. So here's one example from European data, the European household data of the ECB. So as I said, if you've lived through high inflation, you tend to worry about the value of your money, the value of your savings a lot. You feel it might get devalued because, rates and inflation rates will go up. So you're looking for, assets to put your money into, and one of them can be buying a house. That can help us understand why home ownership rates, even within Europe, are so different, right? Like if you take, for example, Spain and France, neighboring Spain and France, like 90% in Spain and much lower, around 60% in France. So how can we explain that? How can we explain other differences? Well, there are, of course, many institutional differences, subsidies, tax deductibility, availability of housing, etc. But after controlling for that, it turns out that if you take the countries which have really high home ownership rates, so including, for example, Spain and the other ones are listed here, and plot average inflation over the last decades, and then you do the same for the countries in Europe which have in the lower half of home ownership rates, then you see the difference, right? The high home ownership rate countries are the high inflation rate countries and vice versa. So it suggests that really important decisions, possibly the most important financial decision you do in your life, whether you buy a home or not, for many households, that's the biggest financial decision, the mortgage borrowing that they take up, seems to be explicable by your personal lifetime experiences with inflation. And by the way, I mean, this is data comparing different countries. One thing Alex Walsio and I did in this paper is to even look at people who now live in the same country, in this case the US, but who immigrated from different countries, some from Argentina, Iran, Iraq, and some from Germany and other European countries. And well, these different home countries have different inflation rates. It turns out you carry that burden with you. If you come from a country which had really high inflation rates, you can't shake it. You know you're in a different country now with a different monetary policy regime, with different circumstances, and yet this worry about inflation and prices going up really triggers you. I saw that in my Argentinian colleagues in 22 when rates were going up. I mean, they were literally going to the bank and trying to put money in safe assets. So what we find exactly that. Also, conditional on being in the same country, you carry your past inflation experiences with you. So there are many examples. I showed you the example on stock market investment, the Depression Babies paper. There's a related theory paper, inflation fears. But you can also, as I alluded to earlier, look at unemployment experiences and how they have a really long-lasting effect on your consumption savings behavior. You can look at home ownership, tenure decisions. We mentioned that. I have a paper that looks at how living under a communist regime that talks a lot about how capital markets are bad and stock markets are only good for a few people has a lasting impact on your attitudes towards investment and particular stock market investment, even if, as in the case of Germany and East Germany, even if that regime isn't there anymore, and you might have even protested against that regime, but like this negative attitude is still visible in your investment decision. And then, as I mentioned in my introduction, I've even looked at international capital flow. So if you have a foreigner who's investing in your domestic market, but hasn't had a lot of experience with knows the theoretical data, but hasn't personally experienced the up and downs of the stock market or financial crisis or economic crisis. As soon as there's a crisis, they put a lot of weight on it. That's all their lifetime experience, that there's a crisis in this country, they withdraw. So the concept of fickleness and retrenchment that's a lot discussed in international capital markets can be related to personal lifetime experiences with investment in these different countries. Domestic investors tend to have longer experience and react more calmly to crises coming up. So that's in the Journal of International Economics. So what we think is that this concept of lifetime experiences influencing your decision making is really applicable quite widely. Whatever, give me an asset and give me data on lifetime experiences of people who act in those markets or invest in those assets. I feel there's a good chance we have predictive power if we have this past information. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, however, is that in behavioral economics, when we study how biases, like non-rational behavior, in this case overweighting of your personal lifetime experiences, how that influences your decision-making, we tend to think and sometimes find that this is in particular the case for, the individual investor, the person on the street, the consumer. But it won't be the case for the smart CEO, for the expert who really knows those markets. And what we found in several settings is that these experience effects, the fact that you can't shake your personal experience, it creeps in when you're making forecasts, affects definitely even the expert. So here's my favorite example from the realm of inflation experiences. We studied the inflation expectations of members of the FOMC in the US, the Federal Open Market Committee. So these are the regional governors and the board members, and who meet to decide about whether interest rates are raised or lowered in the US, who clearly have all the data at their fingertips and are highly informed about what's going on in financial markets. Now, before I show you the data for all the Fed members and how their beliefs are influenced by their personal experience, let me start with an anecdote. My favorite anecdote is a guy who was born as Heinrich Wallich in Germany in 1914 into a family of bankers. He lived through Germany's hyperinflation, which I mentioned earlier, in the Weimar hyperinflation in 1923, and emigrated to the US in the 1930s. He had a very successful career, first at the New York Fed. He got a PhD at Harvard, taught at Yale, and finally was at the Board of Governors for a long time, from 1974 to 86. Now, this person, clearly super smart, all the data available, it still holds the record of dissenting when the Fed chairman tried to lower interest rate. He was a person who was constantly warning his colleagues that inflation is just around the corner, and we rather are a little bit more hawkish and are careful with lowering interest rates. He has the highest number of dissents in Federal Reserve history, and that was decades later, 74, not 23. It was not only in a different time, it was in a different country, different monetary policy regime, and he knew, of course, all of that. He wasn't in Weimar hyperinflation anymore, and yet it seems he couldn't shake it. Now, this is, of course, an extreme outlier. He's so extreme that I needed to treat him separately in my data. But even if I ignore Heinrich Wallich, if you try to regress FOMC members' inflation experiences on their forecast on their inflation experiences, you get a very clear positive slope. So my colleagues, David and Christy Roma, have shown in an earlier paper that when FOMC members in their semi-annual monetary policy reports to Congress make forecasts of what they think inflation will be, they tend to perform worse than their staff. Right? So their staff puts in the so-called green books, like they run the numbers and say, okay, we think you should say this number. And then the FOMC members say, well, but I think it's a little higher or it's a little lower. And turns out they're typically wrong. The staff is typically better than the FOMC members. So that's the Roma and Roma paper. And basically what we're showing here is, well, we can explain at least one reason why. Because if I take the difference between the FOMC member forecast and the staff forecast on the y-axis, and I regress that on basically your experience-based inflation forecast, again normalized by the staff forecast, I get this positive predictive power. So even members of the FOMC are influenced by these personal experiences. There are many other examples. I'm working with some data of doctors. I'm working with CEO data I could talk about here. Let me just kind of return to the pandemic and just mention, so I don't have research on that, but I do remember when John Barry, who had written a book about the great influenza, the Spanish flu, like the very similar pandemic the world lived through 100 years before, more or less exactly 100 years before COVID, when he was interviewed about this book, of course, started having record sales again a couple of years after he had originally written it when COVID hit us. And when he was asked about, did you expect when you wrote the book that you would witness a pandemic like the one we are enduring, he answered quite honestly that, I think anybody who understands anything about infectious disease knows, like in theory, sooner or later this had to happen, but intellectually understanding it is one thing, and having it hit you is quite something different. So I'm like everybody else in that sense. In other words, you really, he's an expert, but I saw a lot of Latin here today in Cambridge, so to fold in some Latin. If you think about where Latin comes from, experire, like experience, is the participle present. Where is it composed of? Well, ire, walk, per, through something and coming out. Differently, having an experience. And that's, I think, really what experiences do us. They hit us and we walk out of them being different. So kind of to say again what I started with today, we economists tend to attribute belief formation, updating of our beliefs, to information we get. We feel like if somebody is forming the wrong beliefs, they probably haven't gotten the right information. That must be, asymmetric information, biased information, that must be the reason. So it's information that leads you to come up with different beliefs. Well, that can't explain everything, as we just saw in my examples. Then kind of the behavioral economist came around and said, well, that was a little too extreme. The homo economicus, the guy who perfectly takes in all information, updates perfectly, and comes up with the right solution, that was a little extreme. That explains some things, but let's be more realistic. Let's make this robot or this computer more human, and let's basically build in some bugs into the software. Let's make them overconfident or have some cost fallacy, limited attention, all these human things. And that is, of course, good. I'm a card-carrying member of the behavioral economics tribe. But what I'm trying to point out here is it's not enough. That's still a computer, right? You just program them a little bit differently, and then they walk through life and do their overconfident behavior and so on. That's not how life works. Life changes us. We are living, breathing organisms, not organisms, and we should, as economists, take the predictive power we have from neuropsychiatry, biology, medicine, that tells us under which circumstances our body changes, our brain gets rewired seriously. So specifically about the brain, I've started to think a lot about this concept of neuroplasticity. The idea we know from neuroscience, or the evidence we have from neuroscience, that every time we make a new experience in our lives, there's a connection formed between like two neurons, like one fires and talks to the other, like a synapse is formed, which tells our body to react, how to react to the world around us, and that governs the way we experience life. Now, crucially, the brain can reorganize the pathways, create new connections, even create new neurons throughout our life in response to learning, experience, memory, foundation. And while young brains tend to be most sensitive, right? That's why we parents work so hard to impress on our kids, the right views and reactions. Well, this responsiveness to experience persists throughout lives. The brain never stops changing. So if we walk through crisis, like inflation, Weimar hyperinflation, there's like this, if I see prices rising, the connection to fear is really strong. Now, I won't be like this forever. I will update further if inflation comes down again, but for a while it will be that way, even when we are back to normal. How and how often we make an experience here matters. So if I get a lot of stimulation, then that can induce a prolonged increase in the synaptic strength. That's long-term potentiation. So that's why I'm happy that the UK inflation is coming down. If that has been going on for a few more years, I would have been worried about all of you and your inflation scarring, but maybe that was short enough. And what's also interesting is that emotions seem to be a really important role. So if I experience something with strong emotion, whether positive or negative, that tends to get ingrained more in my memory, emotional tagging. And professors like me thinking if I just teach you, it's fine, credible Fed policy, inflation is going to be fine for now, I just have no chance. I have very limited power to undo what personal experiences did to you. And my view now is that we can learn a lot from the literature in neuropsychiatry on trauma, on synaptic changes caused by traumatic stress. Importantly, while I'm talking about these big traumata, like German hyperinflation, Great Depression, pandemics, there are also the small t traumas, the daily exposure to worry about food prices, unemployment, the scarring of food insecurity, which can have a lasting effect on how we are wired. And that's something which we in economics should take more into account. So let me give one example before I get to the CEO case, which is inflation fears and shopping. So in work with Francesco da Cunta, Ospina and Weber, we've looked at how do people really, where do their beliefs about inflation really come from? And if you offer them many possible sources, like some news media, radio, newspaper, online news, social media, people you talk to, family, friends, colleagues, etc., financial advisors, what always comes out is that they think about their recent shopping. They think about, okay, what did I see was happening to the milk prices, to butter, to bread? That's what comes to their mind and seems to have a strong impact on how they will answer the question of how prices will develop. Now, what we realized is that this can probably help us explain this decade-old puzzle on gender differences in inflation expectations. So pretty much any sample you look at, there was first a Swedish sample from, I think, more than 50 years ago, and that has been replicated in different countries and in the US at different times. Females tend to be more pessimistic, meaning expecting higher inflation than males. And people have been struggling to explain that. Is it financial education? Are women not financially educated enough? Can they just not do math? Like, what's wrong? Why do they have all these kind of high inflation expectations? Well, what we asked, and this is actually from the time before inflation spiked, is before 2021, in just the 3 years before, we asked people about their inflation expectations. We were basically near zero. We had very low inflation. We asked people, okay, what are your inflation expectations? We asked even males and females within the same household, so we could do even within household comparison, and replicated, that's on the left, if I take female minus male, we replicated the gender difference. Females have significantly higher inflation expectations, only 0.5% because we had this period where we barely had any inflation. And then, we regressed on the usual suspects, education, demographics, etc. It's robust. Then we were able to ask them the following question. In your household, who does the grocery shopping? Do you do any grocery shopping? Why did we ask that? Well, we asked that because famously, grocery are among the most volatile in terms of inflation. And we know from prior research, and my own research, there's lots of prior research that shows that people tend to remember a lot the increases and less the decreases. So if you give them very volatile prices, they remember all these increases and think, whoa, prices keep going up. Conforming with traditional gender roles, it tends to be in the US, this is US data, 60 to 70% of female women doing the grocery shopping in the household. Some men participate, and so then we redid our regression. What are your inflation expectations, or rather the difference of female versus male on all these controls? And then we put on the right-hand side this one variable. Does the man do any grocery shopping in that household? And turns out, if that's the answer is yes, the gender difference completely disappears. It is entirely driven by family situations where only one side, typically the female, is doing the grocery shopping. So the large difference, this large difference we observe in the data can't be fixed by better financial education, by better trainings in mathematics. No, you need to take into account what is the lived experience. What world does man and woman, in this case, live in? What prices do they see in their daily life? In fact, I would love to do like an experiment with Google Glasses where I can literally see all the prices somebody sees throughout their day and kind of calculate personally experienced inflation that way. I predict that this will have high predictive power. So basically, in this quick overview about what the literature on inflation expectation, on experience effects is about, I emphasized that what you personally live through in your life seems to have a lasting effect on how you expect the world to develop in the future. Even if, in the case of a crisis, the crisis is over, we are back to normal. If it was an unemployment crisis, we are back to full employment. If it was an inflation crisis, we are back to monetary stability. If it was a stock market crisis, we are back to positive stock market developments. This experience is somewhere still in you, has changed your thinking. We model this as it has changed your outlook of the future and therefore affects your behavior. So the route we are proposing here is, rewiring of your brain using neuroplasticity. But what I want to basically, give a pitch for is that as economists, more broadly, we should be thinking more about what experiences do to us as I said earlier, living, breathing human organisms, which have not only these abstract beliefs, we have a brain that can change, we have a body that can change, that can suffer from the crisis we live through, that can be more or less tense, can age faster or less fast. We have an abundant literature on the long-term effects of exposure to stress. why don't we take that more systematically into account in economics? So some of development economics, economics of poverty is trying to do that, for example. The literature on food insecurity is trying to do that. But I believe that there are many more systematic insights, differences between males, females, differences on what's the age when you experience this insecurity, which we could use to make better predictions and design better policy in economics. And one way for me to try and show that, going away from the brain and go to the broader body, is to show accelerated aging effects after stressful experiences. So this is the paper I want to spend a little more time on now is this long-term, CEO stress, aging, and death paper with Mark Borgschulte, Marius Günzel, and Sanya Olier. So the application here of crisis effects is to CEO health. Basically, we want to assess whether living through a crisis leaves a lasting impact, not only in your beliefs and future decision-making, but a lasting impact I can actually see on your body, on your health. I would have loved to measure hormones in people's bloodstream or other measures of stress. I was not able to get at this data, but I have some visual measures of aging, and of course I have measures on longevity I can use. We introduce in this paper also some, I think, pretty cool new tools, visual machine learning. So even if that's not your area of interest, maybe some of these tools might interest, and basically apply this visual machine learning to a hand-collected data set of 3,000 photographs of faces of people. Some live through crisis experience, some not. I mean, CEOs in this case, and see, how you change differently over time. But we also use hand-collected birth and death data of these almost 2,000 CEOs of large US firms. And I won't have time to cover every single result. So basically our approach is, the three approaches, and I'm going to touch on the first two, is number one, let's take a group of CEOs who run the largest US companies. All of them went through the financial crisis, 2007-8. So I collect data of CEOs who were CEOs in Forbes 500 companies in 2006. And some of them, but had a real industry distress shock. So the industry, not just their company, totally slumped. And I compare them to those who had like an easier path through the crisis. And then I say, how did their aging change? Do I see differences in how they look like before and after the crisis? Second one, I do the exact same, but not just for the financial crisis, for other industry distress shock, and look at the effect on life expectancy. And the third one, which I won't spend time on today, is variation in anti-takeover laws. So it's kind of the opposite of a crisis. So when in the US, these anti-takeover laws, these different waves of anti-takeover laws were implemented mostly in the 80s, that made life as a CEO much easier. There couldn't be, somebody come in, buy up a bunch of shares, and then kick you out. You were a little more protected. And CEOs said, there's these famous quotes like, that was the biggest good thing that happened in their life, maybe after their marriage, but definitely next in line. So we have some cool quotes in the paper on that. All right, just a quick note. In this paper, I focus entirely on CEOs, and sometimes I get the question, financial crisis was bad for many people, and CEOs, they got at least millions, if not billions, in reward. Like, why are you focusing on them? Why are you not focusing on the nurses in the hospitals, the emergency room doctors, any other people, who were really suffering to this time? The short answer is, it's a convenience sample. I need, have a large data set of pictures which are dated, where I can look at how you change over time. With these celebrity managers, I'm able to do it. I would love to have a large data set on nurses, for example, pre and post-COVID, etc. If any of you guys have ideas for how you can get a time series on facial pictures, let me know. I'll just do what we're doing there. I think that could be really interesting. So now that's the main reason, convenience sample. It's also, CEOs are important. I've done several studies on CEOs. They do have a significant impact on the lives of many people who work in their firm. So I think it's also important to study them. In particular, given that the academic literature and policy discussion about CEO, which tends to revolve around pay, performance, and incentives, and how CEOs are the epitome of moral hazard, right? They get entrenched and use their power to, use the private jet of their company to fly to the golf course and enjoy their lives there. And sure, there are some examples, but a lot of, the whole principal agent literature, the whole moral hazard literature developed using these managerial examples. Jensen Meckling as a famous starting paper in 1976. And the key ingredient in this literature is that there's some kind of private benefits. As a CEO, I'm supposed to maximize shareholder value. I'm supposed to do the best for my shareholders, maybe a broader range of stakeholders, but instead, I also get this private benefit B out of doing some stuff which is not so shareholder value maximizing, like low interest loans to my family, jets, golf, and etc. And that's the ingredient in the model we use. And basically what we're saying here, well, there's less attention paid to, but maybe we should think also about private cost C, especially health cost, right? CEOs do have a demanding job and work many, many hours, even on the weekends, even during vacation days. And, there are many Harvard Business Review and CNN and whatnot, articles about how CEOs cope with the constant stress and how overworked and overstressed they are. So I think they're also a pretty good sample to look at this flip side of private benefits. So what do we do? So the summary, again, I won't cover everything, but just to give you the big picture is that we show that exposure to an industry distress shock while you're running the company increases your visible aging, your so-called apparent aging. I'll tell you in a second what that variable is exactly, by 1 year. And that is a lot. It is in particular a lot, given that in the mortality study, we then find that corresponds almost 1-to-1 towards how earlier you die, which is 1.1 year. So there is a really big impact on your longevity, suggesting that a lot of bad changes are happening in your body while you're living through a crisis. Quick aside again, the visual learning technique of detecting aging and stress from photographs of faces is something which I hope those of you who might have access to such data maybe want to look up in our paper. I'll just cover it a little bit here. So here's I thought I had one more. No. Here's my quick intro to what we do. We get these 3,000 photographs of CEOs of Forbes 500 companies. So if you go to the 2006 Forbes 500 list, it actually lists 1,000 firms, which I never fully understood, but we took those 1,000 firms and tried to get as many pictures as we could of those CEOs throughout their tenure as CEO. We needed at least 2, one before the crisis and one after the crisis, but we typically have 7 or more of those pictures for people who are in our sample. Then we got actually from the Oxford Visual Learning Group, a machine learning program that was trained on Wikipedia pictures and IMDb pictures, which was trained to predict apparent age. So what is apparent age? Wait a second, do I have a separate slide on that? No, there's an outcome. What is apparent age? Apparent age is a variable, I didn't know it before this study, which is different from biological age. It's a variable which physicians use a lot. So if you walk to the office of your physician, who clearly knows how old you really are, they have your birth year, etc., one of the variables they write down a lot is how old you look to them. So it's not about trying to best guess how old you truly are, but how old do you look to them now? And it turns out there are many medical studies that this has high predictive power in terms of what will happen to you in the future, whether there's inflammation in your body, whether there will be a motor ability decline, whether there will be a cognitive decline. It appears to be one of the most powerful variables physicians use in the initial assessment. So what these programs of the Oxford group try to do is to best predict exactly this variable. So not how old you really are, but how old you look to humans. How did they do that? Well, they did it in a 2-stage program where they first trained this 500,000 data set of pictures from IMDb and from Wikipedia on predicting the biological age. And then they got a really large data set on at least 10 humans assessing how old a person on a picture looks, and then fine-tuned their program to predict this human prediction. And so that's the program we used. To use it, we needed to first get pictures that are exactly right. They had to be 224 times 224 pixels, times 3 for the color, red, green, blue. And then the program, which is a convolutional neural network, basically does the following, which always makes me uncomfortable as a classically trained, empirical person. It doesn't like say, oh, let me use the wrinkles or the hair colors, or no. For those of you who've worked with these programs know, it slides over the picture and detects some patterns and convolutes the meaning. It transforms this input by sliding over or convolving over it and detecting a pattern such as, say, the edges or the corners in these examples into a matrix, and then matrix multiplying as it goes along and discovers more and more features. And at the end, what it spits out is not an age, but really a vector with 100 components, so from 0 to 99, these are the different possible ages. It gives me probability of you being that age, and I'm going to use the expected value as the predicted age. So the program we are using performed very well. I don't know if those of you who work on the intersection with computer science know that how they publish their papers is they go to these conferences, goes in conference volumes, and they participate in competitions. And so this one has won the visual age competition. From what we did, also from testing it with humans in our case, we can only confirm it performed very well. So let me give you an example of where the identification in this paper comes from. I don't know whether anybody knows this guy. His name is James Donald, is the CEO of Starbucks from 2005 and 2008. And basically, I don't know whether somebody wants to venture a guess here, but I'd be happy to get your guesses on how old he looks to you on the left and on the right. Maybe, I don't know whether anybody is willing to share what they think.
45.
On the left and on the right?
55.
Well, you're very generous. My PhD students are much tougher. They're like 55 and 65. I see some nodding up there. So it turns out you are definitely right on the right one. Like, he is 55, and the left is 50. So most of the students who have given me guess before were more like 55 left, 65 there. What the program does, it says 53 and 60. Now, the exact level doesn't matter so much, right? We're trying to take out the individual fixed effect, how old you think such a person looks like. But you get a 10-year difference in there. Our program says it's a 7-year difference in apparent age. Now, the crucial thing is that the actual difference is 4.4 years. Now, of course, I hand-selected that example to fit my story, but but we were taking obviously everybody, but that's the idea. And it fits totally because he's a CEO of Starbucks. Starbucks was in trouble during the Great Recession. In fact, the guy got fired in 2008, so no wonder that he aged a lot. He's a little bit unusual in that actually most CEOs look younger than they actually are. And that's also previous results, that beauty and young, as measured by symmetry of your face and how young you look and how tall you are, helps you in your occupational achievement, in your career achievement possibilities. So this guy actually looks older, but it doesn't matter if you look older or younger. What it matters is that you age faster when you go through a crisis. And so what we do then is to estimate this in a controlled regression framework. I'm not going to show you regression tables, but I'm just going to show you a graph which says on the left-hand side, I put your apparent age gap, like this predicted apparent age minus the actual biological age. And then on the right-hand side, I control for all sorts of control variables I have for COJ as represented in picture I at time t. I put time in fixed effects. I put CO fixed effects. And then I put a dummy for, during your time as a CEO, did you live through an industry distress shock? And the notion which typically used, or the measure typically used in corporate finance for an industry distress shock is that the stock returns plummeted by at least 30% over a 2-year horizon in that industry. And I'm obviously for the empirical economists here, I'm using the whole industry to get rid of an endogeneity problem where you're a bad CEO running your company in the ground. But is it the whole industry shock? So for graphical purposes, rather than showing you the regression table, I will just bunch people, put them in kind of into roughly equal-sized bins, 8 roughly equal-sized and equal-spaced bins, and show how people who lived through a crisis and how people who didn't live through a crisis during their time as a CEO, and again, it's an industry distress shock, it's not their fault, compare in age. On the left, you see how treatment and control CEOs compare before the crisis. So nobody had experienced an industry distress shock yet. And luckily, I can report there are no significant differences. So it shows you the difference in difference, right? The age gap, the apparent age gap, the difference between your apparent age and your true age for the people who lived through a crisis versus those who didn't, treated minus control, and there's basically zero difference. Then the crisis hits, and you see that the apparent age increases much more for people who lived through a crisis, first half a year, then 3/4, and then about a year out. And that's how it stays. This is not just an effect of during the crisis, now that I'm doing some policy advising, sometimes if I have a bad message about the whatever labor market, the journalists try to show like these pictures, and if I have a good message, I show a different picture. It's not that thing. It's even when I go into their retirement and I got the picture from when they are presiding the local yacht club and at a garden party and so on, you see that they have aged more. So significant differences in aging. One thing, in addition to the selection I worried about is, is there anything I'm not controlling for? I don't like really, I'm doing all this machine learning now, but I don't really like it. I like regressions where I put on the right-hand side, was there natural light or not? Was it a post picture or not? Was it this angle or that angle, right? That's still my thinking. So I threw in a lot of those controls, and of course, nothing changed. And the Oxford people told me, I told you so, but okay, I did that. But I did find that the apparent age gap is correlated with facial expression. So if you look frowning, you do look older, actually, just to know it. If you want to look young on pictures, smile, and you look a couple of years younger. Now, my crisis CEOs were actually smiling equally often to the other CEOs, but just in case, it was confounding our results, we did the following. We did an AI-based image manipulation to change facial expressions from frowning to at least slightly smiling. So here's an example. That's, this guy maybe more in the politician role, Rex Tillerson, who of course was the CEO of Exxon, and then under Trump for a while before he was fired, was running foreign politics. This is the pictures I get of him. He tends to not smile in my pictures. And so then I used AI to manipulate him to make him progressively happier. So I couldn't do all out big smile because then you have to come do the teeth and that's complicated. But so we put everybody 1 to 2 degrees more smiling. It turns out if I take only the fake pictures into my regression rather than the real ones, if anything, my results get slightly stronger because as I said, for some reason the crisis CEOs were, if anything, smiling more, not less. So that's comforting to know. It's not comforting to know what you can do with pictures, but it's comforting to know that it does not affect our results at all. So far, all these results are just kind of how you look like. And you might say, okay, is that just about being a little vain and beauty and you can color your hair and get some creams or something to cover your wrinkles? No, it turns out it's, as the physicians told me, it's a really good predictor of what's actually happening to your health. So to study the question of does it have really an impact on your health, I couldn't use that sample I just showed you. It's a pretty recent sample. Even with the financial crisis, I used an older data set initially collected by Kevin Murphy for the Gibbons and Murphy paper. It's also the data I used in my overconfidence papers. For those of you, I know a couple of you have studied them. These are CEOs listed in executive compensation surveys published in Forbes, which comprises originally more than 3,300 CEOs from the 1980s, 1984 to 1991. And so basically, we took all the CEOs who are in the data set in 75 or later and whose firm is in CRISP and where we could find the birth and the death year. So, or find that they're not yet deceased as of October 2017, that was our cutoff date. Turns out it's actually hard to identify people as alive as long as they're running the CEO, as the CEO running their company. Yes, you get lots of information about them. When they retire, not so much. So I needed to find these kind of newspaper articles of them presiding over the yacht club and so on. we had some success. At the end of the day, I had to hire a private investigator, which seem to have their own data sets, which they won't share with me, but if I pay them a fee, they run it for me. And so we're ultimately able to find the birth and death information for 87% of the CEOs in our sample. And so this is, I don't know how impressive it is, but I didn't want to show regression tables. This is how the Kaplan-Meier survival estimate, just in the raw data, looks like. So what I'm plotting here is, I'm not controlling for anything yet. I'm just setting at 0 the year when a CEO took office. And so everybody's alive when they take office. The survival rate is 1 or 100%. And then I'm counting kind of years since you took office. I'm restricting the sample a little bit to make them comparable between CEOs starting at age 55 or later, retiring before 75, but I'm not controlling for anything. And what you hopefully notice is that the survival rate is visibly right-shifted for those who did not experience an industry distress during their time as CEO. So at times, say, 35, or like even earlier, like 25 years later, it's a difference between 0.5 and maybe 0.59 or so. So there's a significant difference in survival long after you have left office and are already retiring now. So to give you the exact magnitude, the in-sample comparison can be done as follows. 1 additional year of actual age, so you get 1 year older, increases a CEO's estimated mortality by roughly 12%. The effect of an industry distress is larger than that. It is roughly equivalent to making the CEO 1.1 years older. And that is, I don't know, if you don't work with health and death data, I don't know what that means to you, but this is huge. It's one of the rare cases where I found a result where I was like, can we make that smaller? This is too large. In fact, demography people were kind of shocked by it. So to put it in context, I mean, there are larger threats to health. So for example, smoking all life long is associated with a reduction in your longevity of 10 years and more. So that's clearly stronger. But, for example, smoking until age 30 is associated with a reduction in longevity by roughly 1 year. So it's about comparable to that, and that's a very well understood and known threat to health. So we did find that stress significantly adversely impacts your health. So to kind of summarize, the main findings in this paper were that there's significant personal health cost associated with being a CEO in stressful times, due to, whether it's due to industry-wide distress shocks or the results I didn't show you, variation corporate governance regime. If people are monitoring you more closely and you're under the threat of being fired at any moment, that adversely affects your health. And if you're protected from that, you live longer. In fact, the result we have there is even larger. It was a 2-year difference in longevity. These results correspond on death, on longevity, correspond more or less 1-to-1 to the visual aging we can detect in the pictures. I do think that these results have, beyond the agenda I was introducing to you earlier and to which I returned for just a few minutes afterwards, it has interesting implications also for other studies. So one question I've been asking myself is, do we rationally account for the health implications of the job we choose? I know some people visit 125 countries within a year or so. That must be stressful. Did they think about the health implications of this type of choice? Correlationally, I can tell you in the CEO realm, at least there's no compensating wage differential as far as I can say, right? You would think the CEOs who really run under very stressful conditions would maybe be monetarily compensated more than the other ones. That's not the case. I mean, for the labor economists of you won't be surprised. It's often hard to estimate a compensating wage differential unless you have really good settings, but that's interesting. Now, I've also been wondering whether it affects sorting. Who chooses a career path with the sustained goal of becoming CEO, for example? We continue to struggle to get to a world where there's more gender equality in terms of leading C-suite jobs. And we continue to think about the hurdles women have to overcome and whether there's discrimination and so on. I've also been wondering whether there's different selection Whether, could it be, I don't want to stop in the tracks of literature trying to fight discrimination, but I do just want to ask the question, could it be that in terms of gender, people differently take into account the effects these type of jobs may have on their health and on their stress level? That would be just interesting to understand. And then finally, to go back to something I started with, I'm studying CEOs here. Clearly, they're exposed to a lot of stress. However, these job-induced health effects in other worker contexts, where workers are much less well compensated, where they're at the bottom of the hierarchy, could be even larger, right, when you have looming financial constraints. So it would be really interesting to better understand the effects on minimum wage jobs with rigid work schedules, life or death jobs, such as emergency room doctors or pilots or people in air traffic control. So again, if you have the opportunity to study such data, I think there would be a lot of interest, possibly more than in my CEOs. So to kind of link back all of this, kind of summarize all of this with a couple of pictures. And what I was trying to do today, both with the big picture overview on this literature on scarring effects and the long-term effects on our lifetime experiences, is to kind of suggest that we need to continue developing our view of human decision-making and human processing of information and experiences. If we start again with the neoclassical model, right, where we have the Homo economicus, who is a payoff maximizer, perfectly updates his beliefs using Bayes' formula, and all the information coming in is processed with perfect cognition. Then we know, well, this Homo economicus is maybe not the right way to think about human decision-making. It helps us to understand a lot of market forces, a lot of outcome, but there are limits and there are systematic, predictable mistakes we are making if we use this model. So behavioral economics came around and said, well, there are other things we care about rather than payoff maximizing, ethics, moral, honor. So social preferences, for example, is a big literature in behavioral economics. And, instead of, perfectly updating our beliefs, we sometimes get it wrong. So I've worked a lot on overconfidence and how you may take this pawn for a king. And that's real and that's measurable and we should take that into account. And definitely perfect cognition is not quite right. There's limited attention. There's lots of limited cognition going on. So, that made the Homo economicus already a little bit more homo, a little bit more humanus. But what is still missing is that, as I said earlier, as we're walking through life and getting hit with things, that this can have a really lasting effect on it. So these dynamic effects are still missing. So really, oops, I'm missing one. Oh no, I'm missing one of my. So really what I want to add to that is that our brain is changing as we're walking through life. Our body is changing as we're walking through life, and that this is something we need to take into account. So maybe it's a homo experience, or however you want to call him. To sum up the takeaways for those who might be interested in doing kind of research in this area, just 2 more slides and then I'll be done. Number one, you can think about the long-lasting effects of personal experiences on beliefs and risk-taking as follows. If you are interested in understanding some kind of outcome variable, say how much consumption spending, right, that's a variable economists are interested in, how much consumption spending a person I at time t will have, then what we tend to do is we tend to collect all sorts of variables about person I at time t. We tend to collect their income, their wealth, their education, maybe measure their risk aversion, etc. And what I'm telling you is that if you can, try to get not only that vector, try to get the whole matrix of past realization of this variable. Has this person lived through unemployment? Has this person lived through food insecurity? How did they grow up? What kind of trauma and scarring were they experienced, or vice versa, where they're born with a silver spoon in the mouth and don't even know what I'm talking about when I say food insecurity? I bet you that this will have significant predictive power on the outcome variable you're interested in, not just the current realization, which we economists tend to think is a sufficient statistic. Now, these lifetime experiences is not only the big macro shocks I talked about today, the industry distress shocks, the pandemic, the Weimar hyperinflation, etc., trauma with big T. There's lots of important and relevant small t trauma. Our daily experience, what we see in our daily life, the women who see these like fluctuating food prices, which make them anxious as they're doing the grocery shopping for their family, which have a lasting effect, and we should take into account. Third, don't make the mistake to think that you can fix this with information. Even well-informed experts like central bankers, financial experts, physicians are subject to experience effects. It's not a question of intelligence, it's a question of rewiring of your brain. And that just happens to you if you happen to be human. So it's physical in brain and body, not just updating priors. In terms of opportunities for further research, I would say there's lots of things to still be done in the realm of household finance, understanding gender differences, understanding persistent effects of racism, even if the formal barriers are removed. Why might your behavior as if you're discriminated again persist in you? The effect of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, education. These analyses become more and more feasible to us, as you guys are so lucky. You live in the world of big data, where you get access to these big administrative data sets and are able to study these panel data sets that include past information, which have, of course, important welfare and policy implications. So getting access to this big data, using it with information from neuroscience, from biological and medical science is important, and it is important in terms of the different policy implications. So rather than telling somebody, oh, you can do that, there are no formal hurdles, they might to personally experience it. You may have to rope people into, say, women and STEM. You need to give them early experience to working in STEM, to working with STEM ideas, to really bridge the gender gap. Role models can help. There's ample literature which has a revival right now in labor. If you see a female or, say, minority teacher, how this can have a positive impact on undergraduates, continuing and graduate studies. Those effects go above and beyond information and regulation. You need to give people the opportunity to really participate in this world. And I will stop with that. Thank you very much.